Hello everybody, this is Destrad with Out of Mobs, and welcome to our 25-man normal encounter guide for Feng the Accursed. He is the second boss that you're going to encounter inside of the Mogashan Vault raid. It's a 3-phase fight with a lot of different abilities that he'll use in each of those phases. We'll go over all of those in this guide. For this kill we use 6 healers, 2 tanks, and a variety of melee and ranged DPS. Again, this is a 3-phase fight, and phase 1 doesn't start until Feng hits about 95% health. That phase will then last until he gets to about 66% health. Phase 2 will begin as soon as phase 1 is over. Phase 3 will start at about 33% health, and it doesn't end until the boss is dead. Let's start by going over the abilities that Feng the Accursed is going to use throughout this encounter. First off, at the beginning and through all 3 phases of this encounter, Feng the Accursed will cast Spirit Bolts. In 10-man normal, this Spirit Bolt will target 3 random players in your raid. In 25-player difficulty, it targets 8 random players. In 25-man, it does about 115,000 shadow damage. In 10-man normal, that's about 96,000 shadow damage per bolt. These Spirit Bolt casts are also kind of hard to predict, as it seems to change as he uses his other abilities. The next ability we need to talk about is an ability that he'll cast on one of the tanks. In phase 1, that ability is called Lightning Lash. In phase 2, it's called Flaming Spear. And in phase 3, it's called Arcane Shock. Each of these 3 abilities will do a significant amount of damage to your tank up front, but it also puts a dot on the tank that does 30,000 damage every 2 seconds for 20 seconds. This ability will warrant a tank switch. Our tanks and healers agreed that about 2 stacks seem to be when you need to taunt off one another. So let's get right to it. The initial pull really doesn't matter on positioning. The tank will pull him up front, and from 100% to 95%, all Feng's going to do is general melee attacks and cast Spirit Bolts. The important thing that will happen just a few seconds after the initial pull is there are 2 crystals that will spawn. These crystals are very important to the rest of the fight because your tanks can get extra abilities by use of the extra action key by clicking on these crystals. 1 crystal per tank. One of the crystals will give you Nullification Barrier, which creates a protective barrier around the tank who uses it, lasting about 6 seconds. Keep in mind this is also channeled. Anyone inside the barrier is protected from magic damage and debuffs. The ability has about a 1-minute cooldown. This effect will also affect the boss, preventing him from receiving certain buffs from his own abilities, which becomes important during phase 2. The other crystal will give one of the tanks an extra action button, which will give him Shroud of Reversal. It's a buff that the tank can place on a raid member. This allows the tank to mimic the first spell cast against that ally and to cast it back at the boss. The ability has about a 30-second cooldown and also is very important during all phases of this encounter. So now the tanks have their buffs. The tank that has Nullification Barrier, we'll call him the Barrier Tank. The tank that has Shroud of Reversal, we'll call him the Shroud Tank. The abilities that the tanks receive from the crystals become very important throughout all phases of this fight. In phase 1, Feng is going to cast one of 4 spells. He casts Spirit Bolt throughout the entire encounter, including phase 1. Remember, it targets 8 random members of your raid and does moderate amount of damage. But during phase 1, he'll also be casting Lightning Lash. We've already talked about Lightning Lash. That's the debuff your tanks will get and need to swap after 2 stacks. The other 2 abilities he casts during phase 1 is Epicenter and Lightning Fist. Epicenter is an earthquake ability that lasts for about 10 seconds and deals damage to all raid members every second. The damage that Epicenter does is lower the further away from the boss you get. The other ability he'll be casting during phase 1 is Lightning Fist. He regularly casts this in front of him, and anyone in the path of the shockwave takes a large amount of nature damage and is stunned for a few seconds. So it kind of goes without saying that your tanks need to make sure they strafe left or right to get out of the way of Lightning Fists. Most of the time, your barrier tank is actually going to want to get hit by Lightning Fists from time to time during phase 1. Let me explain how this works and how we handle the damage that these spells do from Feng the Accursed. First off, you want to make sure your entire raid is stacked up behind Feng and that your tanks are in front of him and try to get them at about a 90-degree angle from one another. This will make dodging Lightning Fist much easier on your tanks. The first time that Feng begins to cast Epicenter, very quickly, your barrier tank wants to run into raid and uses extra action key to cast Nullification Barrier. The damage from Epicenter is almost completely nullified. It's very little, if any. You do want to keep in mind, though, that Epicenter lasts 10 seconds and your Nullification Barrier only lasts 6 seconds. So you're either going to have a little bit of damage in the beginning or at the end that you're going to have to heal through. But since you're stacked up, it's very easily done by using AoE heals. Keep in mind, this is not the time to use any large healing cooldowns. You'll need to save those for later. Immediately following Epicenter, Feng will almost always cast Lightning Fist. It's important that your barrier tank that just ran in and gave you the barrier to the raid gets back out of raid and gets ready to get hit by Lightning Fist. Once he's hit by Lightning Fist, your Shroud tank, that's the tank with Shroud of Reversal, needs to use his extra action key, targeting the other tank so that he can receive the ability Lightning Fist. That's how Shroud of Reversal works. Now everyone goes back to doing their normal damage, tank swapping at 2 stacks until Epicenter is cast again. This time when Epicenter is cast, the tank with Shroud of Reversal uses his extra action key and casts Lightning Fist towards Feng. This will stun him right after he starts to cast Epicenter. You want to make sure that your tank's not casting it too soon, or he'll lose the ability and then Epicenter will most likely wipe your raid. You also want to make sure that he doesn't wait too late, so that there's no unneeded damage going out to your raid. In effect, this ability stuns Feng and causes him to dance a funny little jig, but the idea is that he stops casting Epicenter. And that's pretty much phase 1. You want to make sure that your tank's timing is perfect. If a tank misses an Epicenter, either with a barrier or with a Lightning Fist, you can pretty much guarantee either you're going to waste a lot of healing cooldowns or you're going to have a raid wipe. It took our tanks a few tries to get this figured out, and I'm sure it'll take your tanks a few pulls to figure it all out as well. But once you get it down, phase 1 goes by rather smoothly. Healers should be able to transition into phase 2 with most of their mana, and everyone's health pool should look pretty good. Now we go to phase 2. Phase 2 begins when the boss reaches 66% health. The boss will travel to the statue of the Spirit of the Spear and imbue himself with the abilities of this spirit. The 2 abilities he receives during phase 2 is Wildfire Spark and Draw Flame. Wildfire Spark is a debuff placed on a random raid member, which after 5 seconds turns into a fire patch. The fire patch will expand and move along the floor of the room, dealing high fire damage per second to anyone standing in it. Raiding 101, don't stand in the fire. Feng usually applies this debuff several times in quick succession on random raid members, after which he'll pause for about 30 seconds before applying it several times again, and so on. During this, he'll use Draw Flame, his other ability. In this ability, he absorbs all the wildfires present on the platform, stacking a buff on himself. The number of stacks of the buff is proportionate to the amount of wildfire that he absorbs. The buff causes Feng's melee swings to deal a large amount of fire damage to the entire raid. Each melee swing also removes a stack of the buff. Keep in mind that as he transitions from phase 2 into phase 3, if he has stacks of this buff, those go along with him into the next phase. How we dealt with wildfire is very simply, as soon as you get the debuff on you, you need to run out of raid as far away from the raid as you can get until the wildfire comes off of you, and then run back into raid. Now after 2 or 3 of these wildfires get out there, remember when you're running towards the fire that someone else has dropped, don't run into their fire. Again, raiding 101, don't stand in the fire. If you remain in the raid pile while Wildfire Spark is on you, it'll drop the fire right in the middle of the raid, and I can tell you that's a lot of damage that goes out really, really quickly. When Feng actually does get around to casting Draw Flame, all the wildfires in the room move quickly along the floor to his position. Now your barrier tank, if he casts Nullification Barrier on the boss when Draw Flame is about to finish casting, it'll prevent Feng from applying the buff from Draw Flame, which is great because then his melee swings won't do that massive AoE damage to the entire raid. This is possible every other Draw Flame cast because of the cooldown from the Nullification Barrier buff. But this should especially be done when the boss nears that 33% health when he's going to transition from phase 2 into phase 3. Raid leaders, you need to keep an eye on this and keep an eye on the DPS. You may have to call for guys to stop attacking the boss until the stacks get dropped low enough to where you can get out of there and transition into phase 3 nice and smooth. So phase 2 really boils down to surviving Draw Flame and making sure that your raid members with Wildfire Spark get out of raid and drop the flame patches far away from the raid pile as possible. Surviving Draw Flame is very easily done with Barrier, but remember you can only Barrier every other one. That means every other Draw Flame, healers will have to use their cooldowns, and it's a good idea to have your healers set up on a rotation for this. And that's phase 2. Now we go into the last phase of the encounter. The third phase. The boss will transition to this phase when he reaches about 33% health. The boss will travel to the statue of the Spirit of the Staff and imbue himself with the following 2 abilities. Arcane Velocity. which is a channeled spell that deals raid-wide damage to all players. Now, unlike the first phase, where if you were close to Feng you took more damage and further away you took less, in this phase, with this ability, Arcane Velocity does less damage to players very close to him and much more damage to players further away. The other ability he receives in this phase is Arcane Resonance. It's a debuff that's placed on one random raid member in 10-man and two random raid members in 25-man. This buff causes arcane damage every second to the player that's affected by it and to all allies within 6 yards. It's also important to note that the damage is multiplied by the number of allies it affects. This ability can very quickly cause your whole raid to wipe if not handled properly. The best way that we found to handle his abilities in this phase is very simply stack your tanks in melee right in the center, right on top of Feng. Arcane Resonance seems to prefer ranged DPS players and healers. The strategy we decided to go with was to spread our ranged DPS players and our healers around the room, and we watched the counter for Arcane Velocity. Just before it was ready to go off, we made sure to collapse in one big raid pile there on the boss. However, the two players in 25-man that's targeted with Arcane Resonance need to stay away from that raid pile, at least 6 yards away. It's also important that the players that have this debuff understand they do not need to go max distance away from the raid, because they'll take much more damage from Arcane Velocity. Just far enough away to where they're not hitting the raid with their debuff, but they're also not taking max damage from that Arcane Velocity. The key to the third phase for us was understanding that just before Arcane Velocity was finished, we need to spread out almost immediately, because new Arcane Resonance debuffs were going to go out. Remember, Arcane Resonance prefers ranged DPS and healers, so melee and tanks can stay right on top of the boss. While Arcane Velocity is being cast, healers should expect a massive amount of damage to be going out raid-wide. Most of the raid will be taking damage from the Velocity, while the players affected by Resonance will be taking damage from the debuff as well. This is the ideal time for healing and defensive personal cooldowns. This is also when we decided to use our heroism. So in a nutshell, the third phase is very simply put. Ranged DPS and healers spread out, melee and tank stack on top of the boss. Before Arcane Velocity goes off, everyone collapses in a raid pile on top of the boss. Arcane Resonance players stay out of that raid pile. As soon as Arcane Velocity is done, or preferably just before it's done, ranged DPS and healers spread back out. You rinse and repeat this until hopefully Feng goes down and you get the kill. That's been a look at Feng the Accursed 25-man normal. My name's Destrad, and thanks for watching my strategy guide.